Hi, good morning. Niki, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, great. So let's begin then. We are live already. Shravan, you can go ahead.
Okay.
We can't hear you, Shravan.
Audible now?
Yes.
Sorry.
Go slowly.
Yes. Good morning and welcome to KRVIA Encounters. Niki Shah is an architect and urban designer by training, with more than 19 years of work experience in India and the Netherlands. He obtained his B.Arch degree from the MS University of Baroda and Masters in Sciences from Urbanism from TU Delft. He was awarded the M.B. Dave Gold Medal by MSU and the prestigious Netherlands Fellowship Program Scholarship for studies at Delft, which he completed with distinction. Niki leads the design studio at HCP and mentors a multidisciplinary team of architects, urban designers, and planners. He has been instrumental in success of projects like riverfront developments, public spaces, local area plans, transit-oriented development, form-based building regulations, integrated township developments, and master planning for institutional campuses. Some of his key works include Central Vista, New Delhi, Amochi Riverfront and Township Development, Tuenshaling, Bhutan, Sabarmati Riverfront Development, Ahmedabad, Mumbai Port Complex Master Plan, IIM New Campus, Ahmedabad University Master Plan, Swagnam Park, Gandhinagar. Niki is also actively involved in photography and graphic design for HCP's publication outreach activities. He periodically engages with universities as a resource person, jury member, and thesis guide for research and design projects in urban contexts. Niki, welcome to KRVIA Encounters.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Shall I begin, Mamta? Hello.
Yes, Niki, go ahead.
Okay, I'll just stop my video so that.
It would be nice actually if we kept your video on because, with the stream, will be seen. So.
Okay.
If that's possible, I mean, with the internet. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. It's fine.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Good morning, guys. I think you already know me now. Brief introduction. I'm Niki. What I'm going to do is talk about the various our experience on working with the river in the city areas primarily. So that's why my title is working with urban rivers, and go through a series of things or series of subjects we encounter and how we tackle them. So it's a presentation not for a particular project. It's taking example from various actual projects, and some are built, some are underway, and think and talk about what goes into such when you work on a project like this. What goes into the as a planner, as an urban designer, as a landscape architect, what we are supposed to do for such interventions. So let me start. This is something which I love about. So I just want to share this picture. If you haven't seen, it's now easily doable through various softwares. This is India, and as you can see, India has many hills and the mountains and everything throughout the country. Why this particular slide? Basically, the rivers originates from the mountains primarily, and this series of networks of hills and the undulation on the contours results into an extensive network of large and small rivers throughout the country. These are produced on the GIS, so they are real time. And as you can see, there are you can make out from this diagram is the primary rivers and all the tributaries on the and the catchment. So different color grade shows the primary river and all the smaller rivers, which ultimately merges to the larger river. Interesting diagram. When you work on a particular subjects, I think the larger context to the smallest context is there has to be some understanding. So when we think about any particular subject, or in this case a river, we go and understand and study what the topography is, how the river is functional, where the river originates, where it goes into the merge with the sea, what are the other factors and the feature of the river, which ultimately caters to the overall the existence of the river in particular area or a town or a region. This is Gujarat, and the blue color on the right side in the slide, which is marked, is the Sabarmati River, and the red dot shows Ahmedabad, where I'm from currently, and we work extensively in this region. This is another area in Maharashtra. This is near Pune, and you can see all the blue color lines are the various rivers, and the smaller tributaries originates throughout the mountain range of Sahyadri. So it has Pune, Mula-Mutha, Pauna, and Indrayani, and other rivers where we are actively working also in this region. So the study of extensive topography and the natural setup is an utmost and the first most important element, where an aspect which is important for to get in our understanding. So we also go and check the historical pattern of the river. On the right side, this is actually adjacent to India. So it's not India, it's Bhutan. And it's a very, very, it originates from the mountains. Himalayas starts from a very hilly river, mountain river, and goes to in a plateau to Brahmaputra. And it has its own unique features and continuously shifting river course in this particular area. So dealing with this magnitude of water and the river pattern is absolutely important, that we make sure that we don't neglect that for anything we want to do further. Also, if you see this, because of this sharp turn, there's a lot of erosion happens in the region. This is also one of the matter which needs to be dealt with. So this is the kind of quick context what it looks like. In Indian context, there are large rivers and important rivers like Ganga, Narmada, Brahmaputra, and these other rivers exist and they are part of our lives for many reasons. A source of water, a holy river, holiness of the river water, religious activities, ghats, all of them are important and strategically located along the river of large scale. There are other rivers these are many in terms of length or the numbers you can talk about, which goes through the cities, various towns and cities, where the most of the river condition is something like this. This is river shows in Pune, in Baroda, in Rajkot, and many of the places in the country. But there are rivers in the country where are pristine. They are going through the beautiful landscape and the hills and the forest areas, and relatively they are untouched. But as you can see in the horizon, the town is extending, so there might be a threat to such rivers. So when we think about any such interventions on a large scale, one has to, of course, there are issues and the problems we need to solve, but there are preemptive measures also one has to take to make sure that we don't damage the river the way we have done it in the past. So these are the pre-thought of any such work we encounter with. A usual issue with the river condition in the town and areas are that it originates well from the mountains. The river is clean, without any pollutions and everything. Goes through many small villages and everything. Eventually, the river gets, because of the way our river structure is, we have damped those rivers as a source of water, and also to protect the towns and cities from the abrupt floods. And eventually industrialization happened and the city has grown, and eventually the area within the city or the river passing through the urban setup eventually gets polluted. And that's the story of most of the river we have worked with. Planning and design interventions in relation with rivers provide a unique confluence of urbanization and ecology that demands specific responses to the context. Riverfront or river rejuvenation interventions are ideal examples to understand ecologically sensitive urban design. I'm going to restrict myself talking about river and the city context. I'm not going to talk about the river which is in the forest area because it has a different way of looking at it. So what my examples are revolving around cities and the river. That's why it's urban river context. So that please keep in mind. So as an urbanist, it is important to understand various complexities involved in dealing with such interventions and making sure to address each issues and problems categorically to achieve holistic solution. Usually in the Indian setup, we tend to solve immediate problems. We don't think about the larger issues. We don't think about trade-offs. We only worry about one part of the issue and we try to solve them. But if the other points are not addressed, the larger goal of any protection or any such interventions doesn't get fruitful. So those things are important that we think it in totality. So yes, of course, when the rivers are in the original situations, it is pristine, going through the forest, and it's beautiful. As at one point it's dammed, so it's protected also. But when it also passes through beautiful towns. This is not Indian context, but is an example. There are many towns in India who are situated in the mountain ranges, which has a good quality of water and the river. Eventually, when it comes down to the industrial area or any such urban area, it tend to get polluted because we haven't solved the city problem and we tend to rely on the river to take care of our urbanization of the cities. So, and eventually we pollute the river. And that's the most of the condition, smaller nalas to the rivers in the city. This is an example in Ahmedabad. This is 20 years ago. And that's the condition of the river at that time. So when we think about a river as a project, so the quality of water and the pollution is one. Urbanization, threat to the from urbanization is also a second issue. There are people who are living on the river because that's easily available land. It's also a subject which we need to tackle sensitively. Sometimes there are markets and a lot of other economical activity happens on the river. Again, because the land is free. In this case, Ahmedabad, the river is relatively very, it's not perennial river, so it's dry most of the time. Only the flood water or the release water comes from the dam. So most of the year it was empty, riverbed, and that's why the land is easily accessible. So people have started using it for multi-purpose. Due to the urbanization and unplanned development, it also becomes kind of dull and the backyard of the city. You can say the river is always neglected, and we don't worry about too much on that particular aspects. We only worry on the city growth and the urbanizations and the streets and infrastructure, but we tend to forget about the rivers and the natural resources like lakes and other aspects of that. So that also is a concern. Bits and pieces, sometimes the cities have done the measures to protect the city from the flood. So the flood is a threat to many such river in the cities. This is an example of Surat, Tapi, where the city has built the dikes from the stone, which ultimately protects the city, but it's not comprehensive. So the solution is not there yet. Problem is not solved. It has a lot of pollution. Because of the pollution, there is a eutrophication in the river, which is ultimately it's a nuisance. It creates the problem in the river, and many of the adverse effect on that also. There are rivers in the country which is living rivers. There are animals and the crocodiles and the fishes and everything. This is in the case of Vadodara, where the crocodiles habitat is flourished in the river. And so one has to also think about how do you address the safety and protecting the species, the living species in the river. But in a counter, it's a threat to human being also. So because they tend to go in the city area during the flood and actually harm the people. So it's also, we need to understand how do you think in both the aspects. Then there are absolutely dry and rocky riverbeds where the water is really not there in a drier region. So how do you manage that? How do you revive such rivers? So I'm showing you examples and the photos from the various cities we have worked with. There is a huge threat of flood in the monsoon flow. This is in the case of Pune, Bulamutha River. If you know, I've been there. So most of the area next to the river gets submerged during the flood, and it's also a issue with the poor urban design or urban planning, city planning, and how infrastructure, and how do you actually integrate all of that issues together. So in this case, the urbanization has already taken place in the case of Pune, and when the flood comes, these are the official irrigation department irrigation maps, which you can see. So flood actually damages or it inundates the area around it. So how do you manage this also? So these are the associated issues with the urban river, which needs to be taken care of. Otherwise, we won't be able to revive the river, because we are always stuck with this particular subject. How do you protect the flood city from the flood? So in the typical situations like this, although you might have done something, but during the flash floods or the abrupt monsoon, the city gets always flooded. In case of Pune, in case of Baroda, in case of Tapi, in case of Ahmedabad, this was the every year scenario. And the city has to face a lot of loss, sometimes the lives and even the city as urban areas also, infrastructure. So how do you think and how do you manage this, and how do you think about comprehensively on this particular subject? And of course, there are rivers which are pristine. The landscape is beautiful. So how do you make sure that the future urbanization doesn't spoil this river, which we have faced in the other projects or other cities? So there has to be a plan to safeguard such areas for the future urbanization. And instead of corrective measures, I think it has to be a preemptive measure where we can protect the river and the river edges from the beginning, and plan the area or the city in a way that it doesn't damage the way it damages the current in the current context. So that's something we have also addressed in some of the projects we have worked with. So yeah, this is an example or the experience from various cities and the river we have worked along. The common, if you put together and try to summarize what are the key factors or an issue which every river faces in the city. One is the big thing is the pollution. A lot of sewerage water or the industrial waste gets put into the river. Risk of flooding. Most of the river has the flood issue because of the heavy monsoon or the release the water from the dam. So that where the city is flooded. So what do you do with that? Sometimes the water is scarce, depends on the region. So how do you manage and how do you revive the river also in a case of scarcity? Sometimes the city does intervene the development or to try to protect work on the river edge or river front projects, or you can say, but they're unplanned. They're not comprehensive planned. There are piecemeal developments which leads to the further damage to the river. Negligence towards ecology and biodiversity due to urbanization. It's also an example we have understood that this is a problem. disjointed river edge ultimately creates the not so the harmonious edge with the landscape or even as a public access. And it ultimately leads to inaccessibility to the river. Most of the rivers are flowing without anybody's notice. Otherwise, they are a backyard of the city, and nobody actually care about it. Nobody can access it. Nobody can actually use that particularly within the city area, where we have a lack of public space. A river edge becomes and as a human, we have a deep connection between our existence and the water, because that's how the whole civilization has started. So that's why it's important that we give some sort of accessibility to the river from city. So keeping this in mind, and when you see this, the various cities from our experience does try to tackle these issues, maybe some sort of water, or some intervention on the flood management, some intervention on the pollution management. There are so fragmented and bits and pieces and span over decades where that effective results you want to achieve. So when any such matter needs to be, as a planner and as an urban designer, one has to think in totality. We cannot select one subject and try to solve one subject. So we have to make sure that we think in totality. So every time we work with the city on this particular subject, we tell them that, well, there are 10 issues, and if you tackle it only one or two, you won't get the results. So you have to think it in totality and try to come up with a solution which works from every aspect and not just immediate problem and immediate solutions. So yes, so keeping that in mind, we have to clean the river. We have to reduce the risk of flooding by protecting the embankments. It has two aspects. One is from the flooding, the erosion happens to the bank. Ultimately, the river becomes erratic, and it also affects the city. And the flooding ultimately it damages the city and the living areas also where communities residing. Scarcity of water. So how do you retain the water and replenish? There are modern technologies now, treatment plants and everything. So you can actually treat the water of the city and try to revive the river if it's dry. Unplanned and piecemeal development should be integrated development with a singular master plan or some sort, which addresses many issues, as I mentioned. We need to also preserve and enhance the ecology and the biodiversity. Strengthen the river edge and create public access to the river and connect the city with the river. So these are the kind of objectives and the key pointers for any such task. So yeah, when you have this is where we start from, and that's by doing some sort of. Now this is the solutions are city to city different. We cannot make this is the standard template or something, but this is in case of Ahmedabad, where we had to do this to make sure that the polluted water doesn't go, sewage water doesn't go in the river, and it diverts into a treatment plant. Eventually, the treatment plant water even can be used to refill the river. And eventually, after many years of work, the river has become relatively cleaner. And it's a continuous process. So we are still working, the city is still working on and refining this process and making sure that river gets cleaner day by day. The flood, which you see in this case in Ahmedabad, it goes all the way to the property and sometimes more. So it damages the infrastructure, damages the neighborhoods also. And eventually you want to protect them by some sort of embankment. This is the solution worked for Ahmedabad, but in the different projects and different contexts, we have come up with a different, more sensitive approach to the embankment designs also. So yes, a flood will be protected by doing an embankment, which will also doubly use as an accessible space and public space, so people can actually walk on it, not just an engineering solution. So, that's a kind of quick understanding. How do you do that? Eventually, it will protect the city from the flood. Now, this flood aspects also is a highly technical. So it's not just random the calculations or random decision. It has a lot of technical studies needs to be done, hydrology, hydraulics. There are irrigation department. There is a central water works who works and thinks about all of this and come up with the right solution for each river. So we have to go through those processes and the technical studies before we come up and propose any such the intervention. And eventually, the idea is to revive the river and make it more front to the public lives rather than a back of the city. It needs water. It has to be accessible. So treated using the treated water, retaining the water, and eventually using the treated water becomes an absolute necessary for such as one of the solution is that way. It has to be accessible, as I said, with a quick understanding. You need to plan it comprehensive so people can actually access these areas and not to create crowd at particular location and distribute it across the length of the river. And yeah, so this is in case of Ahmedabad. The river is accessible now. Earlier it was not. We also need to make sure that any social or economical activity which happens on the river, and this is not organized. This has come up as the city has grown. Sorry, there is some disturbance coming. There's some microphone on. Just check that. So we need to. So as a part of the project, we need to integrate these facilities and give them the better. There are two issues. We make sure that we give them the right to use the space, so we don't hamper their livelihoods. But because of this activity and the chemical they use, actually they pollute the river. So it's also a win-win situation that they get a good facility and the river is protected from the harmful chemicals they use for such activity. So in Ahmedabad case, we have actually designed a separate campus along the river. It's called Laundry Campus. It's Dhobi Ghat, and it has all the facilities, modern facilities which they need and accommodate all the people who used to work on the river banks. And the water and everything is ultimately goes into the treatment plant and not in the river. So from larger intervention to the small bits and pieces solutions like this, together it helps the success of any such river rejuvenation projects. Slums, yes, the slums are on the riverbank. There is no other land available, so they definitely use this space. But they have every year there is a flood, and their houses get damaged. So it's also a concern for their safety. So at one point, city has to decide there has to be organized the housing for them and not leave them open-ended for any such threatening areas. So in Ahmedabad's case, the housing was developed. The market needs to be, any local economical activity like market needs to be organized, so that we've done it for the Ahmedabad in this case. So these are the quick glimpses on how do you tackle the varieties of subjects, and it can be, it depends on the city and the context. There are different types of issues and cases. But in larger sense, the 7 points are the key factors which have always come across as a something to work on. So I'm going to talk about further on this aspect. So sometimes a situation like this, half-hearted development, the kind of solution we can give them. So this is in case of Mula Mutha River, where the embankment strategy and the landscape and how the water is going to be replenished eventually. Situations like this, there are temples and ghats, and there are trunk lines already laid on the river. How do you make sure that this situation is improved and polluted water, this infrastructure lines, the temple gets access, transform into integrated development with ghats and putting the lines underground and those kind of things. And of course, a situation like this where the living river, like crocodile, you can actually design the habitat in the river, within the river, which helps crocodile to flourish, also protect the city and the people so they don't go in the flood situation in the city area to harm the people. So that kind of solution. So every time when we worked on something, there are, of course, unique characteristics to the particular river and the context. And looking at that aspect, we need to accommodate and make sure that we unilateral decision-making process for any such master plans or the design. So after doing all of this, of course, in the situation like the river is already polluted and river, there are standard solutions which I've explained. But there are rivers like this, they're pristine, it's the green and landscape. So how do you tackle such, if this is the part of the project, let's say there are 20 kilometers of the length of the river, and only the small portion of the river edge is urbanized, the rest of the river is something like this. But there is a plan to expand. The city is going to grow, and as you can see in the horizon, the city is already expanding along the river. So how do you make sure that these rivers are protected as a part of the overall plan, rather than doing the same process? Let's get the problem first and then try to solve it. How can we integrate this riverfront project or river rejuvenation project as a larger city master plan? So that's something which I want to elaborate further on this. So this is, I'm quickly showing an example, which we are recently working in Pune. This is a river called Indrayani. It's around 20 kilometers long in total length. This is a quick contextual pictures. So there are the flatlands and there are smaller hills around. There are also urbanized area and large facilities, and the campuses have come up along the river. There are temples, there are ghats, there are crematoriums. But you can see in the satellite image, the city is not yet all the way to the river. You can see small settlements and the urbanization. You can see here the societies have come up. So 5-10, when we look at the pattern of such urbanization, in coming 5 years, the entire this region will be urbanized. As the transportation lines, the infrastructure lines and everything gets built, the city will expand, and we will have the same issue with the river, which we see in the other urban areas. So our approach in this is to plan this river rejuvenation project in a way that it protects the river from the beginning, and the city has a particular limit where they can expand and not to damage the river edge. Different activities. There are important temples in the ghats where a lot of tourists and the devotees come every day and the year, and it has a direct relation with river water. So when we do, we also go and think about what are the different activities and what is the current pattern of development, and we try to map them in the total length. And most of the area, it's an open land, the forested agricultural land. There are smaller points, smaller interactive areas where the city has come all the way to the river, or some religious activity and the industrial activities. So keeping this in mind, how do you approach such a river? So we study extensively what is the current age of the river in terms of the vegetation, trees, and so it is important that we understand the local flora and fauna, which helps take a decision on how do you actually make this age more landscape age. We also study the immediate land use and what is the current situation. As you can see, most of the age is green. That means it's agricultural lands. But the city is expanding already towards that. So this agricultural lands will get diminished at one point, and the city will age the river. We also study, as I mentioned earlier, in detail hydrology and hydraulics. So every river in our country has a map showing inundated area. There is always a high flood lines and the frequent flood lines. As you can see, most of the river is flowing in the center, but most of the immediate areas are floodable. So how do you manage that? And of course, there are contrasts. So as you can see, there is an active age and there is a passive age. So how do you make sure that it protects and also put the river more in a daily lives of the people? So there are limited points where people actually can access the river, but rest of the time it is an open land. So primary objective, keeping all the other points in mind to make sure that we protect the edge for further erosion. There is a constant erosion and of the lay of land in the edges. So we need to make sure we protect the land. And in this case, we have tried to keep maximum or 99% as a natural age, strengthen the plantation, strengthen the age, make sure that it doesn't damages the future floods or the frequent floods, and the vegetation, everything grows. And there is a limit for any city to grow. And there are various studies of the river age and how the river is done. There are land ownership. So urban design, urban planning doesn't happen if you don't worry about who owns the land. We can intervene in public land. We cannot do anything in the private land. So it is absolutely important that we map all the land ownership along the river and understand what is the situation in the actual context versus the ownership point of view. So these are the different factors we also tackle, even if the landscape project is there, but this is what is critical. In this case, you can see the red portions are the pinches where the river is actually quite narrow, where the maximum threats are. And so how do you make sure that we also improve upon these aspects? So ultimately, we do protect the river edge and have a laminar flow of the river, where at least there, based on the amount of water it's going to carry during the flood, there is enough width and the depth available where the water can go and doesn't damages the rest of the area. So as you can see, our intervention is minimal in this case, that we have kind of tried to keep the lay of land and the contours similar, made it more strengthened, plant more so it doesn't eventually damages the age and it can sustain the longer period of time, not damages every year. So inundated areas are critical. So how do you do that? Urbanization, future urban. These are the official maps of the city where the city, you can see the city is already expanding all the way to the river. And so eventually the planning angle comes in the picture apart from the river rejuvenation, that how do you make sure that you plan the city in a way that you have enough land for the riverfront projects also. So all of that happens. And as we go, it's a progressive, maybe a protection plan or a river rejuvenation plan where we protect the river. As the city expand, we try to expand and make sure that we restrict the city to a certain level and the embankment remains protected. So quick collage of the situation. This is what it looks like. First intervention is to have a smaller weir in the river, replenish the water, retain the water, give the aging as a protective measure, landscape. In the flood situation, it's by the time if the flood comes, of course, it's still going to be flooded up to a certain level. Eventually, the city will come and have another level of embankments which protects the city from the eventual flood. And that's how the step manner one can grow into the river project. So when we did the master plan for this area, this is a typical zone where this is how the river is. The black line shows the project, or you can say the land ownership, not project boundary, land ownership, river land. The rest of the thing is a private. We do the river aging and the protection measures. We create the edges in a way that the water goes smoothly rather than creates any efflux or the erosion, protects the bank, keeping in mind all the existing activities like temples, ghats, and access points, bridges, pedestrian bridges, and there is a plan for the future also. So this way, it a couple of meters away from the river gets protected, and after that you have all the street networks and the future city. You can say TP schemes were planned locally. The plans were also designed to keep this in mind. So that way, instead of solving the problem once the problem is already exists, this is a preventive measure for approach to safeguard this particular river. And the city has accepted this proposal that we will go in this fashion. So this whole buffer zone of the landscape or the river, the forested land between the river and the urban areas is something which is important intervention. So as you can see, a couple of other areas where the city is already flooded, and there are ghats and temples. How do you integrate that and keep the proposal for the future expansions also? So that way, eventually, we managed to put together a master plan, which is a kind of landscape plan, you can say, which has lot of accessible edges, preserved edges. Is also an idea that not every time the river has to be accessible by people. In terms of, it should be accessible, but not daily lives. It's not only always the recreational areas and the parks and promenades. So there are, in this project, we have tried to minimize that also. The primary objective is to protect the edge. So there is a forestation and the protection. And then there are areas where people can actually go and walk and use this space also. So quick diagrammatic summary. Usually, typically, this is what the edge is. There is a polluted water coming. So eroded banks, flood mitigation. So these areas are always flooded. So how do you strengthen the edge and restrict the flood up to a certain limit? There are a lot of sewerage and other things happen into the river, which needs to be protected. And so there are, even in the situation like this, there are so many inlets coming in the river, which brings the polluted water into the river. These are the actual examples of the location. So how do you integrate that also as a part of the river embankment strategy and try to protect the river from the polluted water? So that's something which is critical step to pollution-free river. So that goes into the embankment and have a continuous termination. And eventually it grows and integrates a lot of other activities also, like parks, smashans and other religious activities, temples. You map all the temples along the river, you can see the concentration where the one number is written. A lot of footfall. So it's important that we take that also an opportunity to improve the facility for the temple campuses also. Yeah, and then as we are doing this, make sure that some of the edges are accessible so people can actually enjoy the river and the public space. There are activities like Ganesh Visarjan happens on the river. So instead of that putting in the river, now many cities have already started doing this, not to immerse the idol in the river, but instead create independent ponds or something which also detach, delinked from the river, and it ultimately doesn't pollute the river also. So these are the smaller intervention eventually help the larger objective. So quickly, how the embankment strategy is, of course, this kind of landscape embankment to protect the edges and everything from the heavy flood and many other aspects, and for the longevity of this such river strengthening, it has to still have the how you say structurally protected. So we have used stone landscape edges, tree plantations, integrated services, and all of that. So various kinds of embankment strategy for that. Try to keep as natural as possible, and it has a multiple technology. You can say, I would say technology, because there are structural solutions to the. So there are stone bedding, stone crate, boulders, the water bound plantation species, which also protects and keeps the edges green and also helps the water slow down in the edges. There are trees, and how do you actually make sure that the landscape strategy and the overall technicality of the tree plantation also gets solved, integrated well, so the forest grows as the embankment being finished. So different kinds of embankment design is we have explored throughout the length, and there are glimpses of that. So using the stone, natural stone, local stone, river embankment, grassing of the edges, and the tree plantation. Depends on the availability of the land, how much we can actually build. So sometimes we have to do a vertical embankment also, but which is submerged, so you won't actually see it. When on the top, what you see is the sloping landscape embankment. So there are various contextual solutions. This is actually from one project only. So there are many different articulation throughout the length, depends on the immediate context. Sometimes you don't have the land. Here you can see a very project ownership ends here. So keeping the water wide as possible, we have only kept just the river protection and quick access. And then, of course, because it's a public space, eventually we create at some location is to have some sort of walkways, sit outs, so people can enjoy this space. So family can gather here on the clusters and the decks like this. So in this case, this is walkway, tree plantation, deck, a sloping embankment, a stone protection edge of the riverbed and the water. Carts, steps, access points to the river next to the temples and the other activities. So yeah, so that's the kind of overall. The point is that we tend to solve the problem once the problem is there, and so we, of course, we have worked with the cities where the problem already existed, and then we try to solve them. In case of Ahmedabad and many other areas, there are projects we are working where the problem is not that severe, but because that in coming years the problem is likely to expand, so we have kind of have a preventive strategy for such projects or the river. And it's a complex task. It is not unilateral or one particular subject, but we have to think about, so we understand the geotechnical strata. So we have a very deep understanding of the soil condition, what it is, the landscape assessment of the existing and the proposed, river training and embankment works, environmental impact assessment, social impact assessment, infrastructure, finance, also an important factor when you pick up a project like this, overall development regulation, guideline for the landscape and the future. So basically we do extensive study. This is in a case of Bhutan Project, we have produced such written documents, which helps the next step to do any physical intervention. And some of the glimpses of the area, what the transformation can look like. These are ongoing projects, and the work will start in coming months in this particular area. This is in Pune. So you can see how the river is in the current situation. All the industrial waste is going into the river, this left corner, and how do you integrate them and have the strategic and the proper embankment. Sometimes the city has actually narrowed down the river in the past, and we have we said that that's not the right way of doing it. So you have to widen the river again and then make it accessible. This is in the center of the town. Also integrate the existing public parks as a part of the river, temples and the ghats, other religious activities like Visarjan, Ganesh Visarjan. So as a result, these are the proposal, and this is a real picture. And I'm showing a couple of pictures from Ahmedabad because that has actually walked, keeping this in mind. So the picture shows on the left is 1980s, and the same photograph in 2018. How the city has transformed so far. Earlier, the threat from the flood, as you can see, this is somewhere 2006, 15 years ago. The city is flooded heavily, and eventually it's protected. And the city has particular way of dealing with this, so that's how the solution is built and done. Promenades now for people to enjoy. The water is relatively much cleaner. The infrastructure is being upgraded also as a part of the city development. And this has become a part of daily lives of Ahmedabadis in this case. So people use it every day. These are some of the pictures I've taken 2 weeks ago. And eventually, when we see the landscape and the trees and the other areas, it has eventually will become more pleasant, and it has become part of daily lives in the city. So basically, that's what eventually. But this photo shows from Ahmedabad, so it doesn't mean that this is what the only solution possible in the rest of the cities. So every time we pick up, so there are different approaches and different solutions. So in case of Pune, we have highly relied on the landscape strategy as a primary driven thing compared to other issues. In this case, the flood was the main problem in Ahmedabad. But it has eventually created a land with a lot of public spaces and projects, which helps city to use it. In Ahmedabad context, there was no public space in the beginning so far. But at least through this one project or one intervention, it has a large public spaces which helps citizens to use it daily. And ultimately, it's all of this meant for people and the nature. So that's how the riverfront projects eventually turn into wherever it is. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Niki. I'd now like to invite Kahin, our discussant for today, to continue the conversation.
I'm going to stop the share so I can see the faces meanwhile, and if it's needed, I could open the presentation again, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. Hi. Just hang on a second and get my camera working.
Hi, Kahin.
Hi, Nikki. That was a great presentation. Thanks a lot. It was really comprehensive and went through many of the things that we learn about in college, but we aren't really able to process that into the way we do our projects. That it's an entire extensive sort of checklist of what you do from start to end, all of the things you consider. So that was a really interesting aspect. Another thing that you talked about that I found really interesting was at the very beginning of the presentation, you talked about the river in Bhutan, that it keeps changing its course. It has this massive floodplain that is probably the size of a city, and also rivers in India like the Ganga and the Yamuna have these massive floodplains. And I feel like there's something very interesting where we start looking at a river in an urban context, and it's not really allowed the latitude to kind of shift its course even a little bit, because right from the beginning you start building along it, you start hardening that edge, so there's no so in that sense, when we intervene in cities, we need to kind of as you rightly said, look away from the rivers, in a larger landscape context, and look at how you deal with sort of channelized rivers more than specifically rivers that you would find in the greenfield side. So yeah, so that was all really interesting because I mean there were many projects, and in all of the projects you've used kind of the same this sort of comprehensive list of things that you've gone through, almost like a workflow that is present in every project. So I was wondering whether you could elaborate a bit on the idea of public, and you talked about the public and private lands and the analysis that you need to go through to figure out where you can intervene, where you cannot. So when it comes to private stakeholders, is it kind of possible to kind of talk about how you approach a private stakeholder? Do you maybe go to them with a proposal, or go to them with an idea to economize a certain part of their land that abuts the river? So is there some thing?
I can talk about that. Yeah. I might not have any particular slide here, but I think I have that one slide. I can keep it open so people can understand.
Yeah, sure.
You can see my presentation.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, I'm going to use this slide to elaborate your point. Yes, I think this is not in the case of, I would say, river, context to the river, but I think it's as a planner, as an urban designer, or even a landscape designer, the ownership ultimately ultimately becomes an important point also. For any architect, the site plan or the project boundary is the kind of, you work within that premise, what you do. Planner and urban designer, landscape people have, I would say, a bit of more say in this, how that can be tackled. City has many mechanisms. For example, you have a development plan, you have a town planning schemes, you have a local area plan, and cities have grown by acquiring or appropriating the private lands. and put together the infrastructure. Our highways are built that way. Our city streets are built that way. So if you take that as a mechanism as a planning mechanism, you can do the same thing for such river transformation projects also. So what we do is realistically and the accurate detailed base map we produce. So in this case, you see this is accurate to accurate base map, where in the bottom two diagram you see all the plots. You can see this longer plots also exist because of the earlier time this was an agricultural land, and that's how they used to divide the plots. The history of plot also we understand a bit in this area too. It's a very interesting study why in the Indian, particularly in the Maharashtra, we have found. And so earlier times, along the river, there was a large plot with the family, and eventually the family separated. Maybe the siblings separated, and they wanted to divide the plot, but everybody wanted the river edge because the water is coming from the river. So that's why the pattern of this longer plot also exists in our cadastral situations. So we understand all of this, we map them, we also verify with the current situation. And in the Indian context, we have this mismatch of what exists on the ground and what is on the paper. So we try to rationalize both of them. That it's absolutely impossible that a river in this yellow area is wider and on the upstream in the red area is smaller. River doesn't flow that way, looking of ownership in mind. River will flow the way it wants to flow. So that's why in reality, it is different. And in the ownership, it's different. So when we do this, of course, we have to tell them that this has to be changed. We cannot keep this in mind. So we come up with the strategy where, of course, we have to minimize the kind of acquisition to the private developer. These are not built houses, they're agricultural land. So that way it is easier for city to ask for the land. What happens as a benefit to the individual owner that there will be a river. River is not going away anyway. This agricultural land eventually, even if it's agricultural land, there is a proper infrastructure around it. Now it's more easily accessible. And also it protects that land, agricultural land, from the flood. So what individual sees, the owner sees that they're getting the benefit. Giving away a fraction of land, 5%, 10% of the land to achieve that is somehow it's kind of win-win situation for them also. So with this project and any other project, we put together a plan which shows how much land we need from the immediate context. Sometimes it is a government land also, sometimes it is a cantonment or an RB land, sometimes it is a private land. And then city opens up a dialogue with individual owners. We help them to understand what are the benefits from this changes or the master plan. And then eventually it falls in place. It's a lengthy process. In case of Ahmedabad, we actually worked for that aspects for almost 10 years. And bits and pieces, everybody agrees, and then we kind of finish.
Yeah, I can imagine, because it has to be a kind of a give and take, because not everyone. Also, it's interesting because as you showed when you were talking about Sabarmati, for example, it's not a process that happens right now. It's not a process that's complete when your project is complete. It needs to continue happening one by one. They shut down the sewage channels, etc. So can we? I mean, first of all, I think that the students may have some questions. So if you do have questions, just put them into the chat box. So the other thing was, it was quite interesting how you kind of considered all of the activities that were taking place before, and rather than shutting down maybe an economic or a social activity, you kind of looked at how to facilitate those activities in a more sustainable way. So that is something that would definitely be something that is
what we understood from as our team, we planners and urbanism, we worked with city for almost 50 years now, and it's not the river project we experienced is that any urban planning project, if we don't incorporate all the stakeholders and we don't try to communicate and involve people also, uh, there is a highly likely chance that the project won't go beyond your paper reports. So when we approach any such issues and everything, we really think what is necessary. There is no objective or saying, okay, all of this has to go. We only need fancy riverfront project. No, it's not like that. So as a process, we also improvise as a city or as a master planner and along with the client. In the situation in the earlier time in Ahmedabad case, there was a housing, slum housing, a rehabilitation housing also proposed on the riverfront in the first master plan. Eventually, looking at the numbers and the facility they need and the overall city connections they want from the public transportation and many of the aspects, it was decided that instead of giving them everything on the riverfront, it is better that they put on the various part of the city areas where the other community is already living. There is a neighborhood basically. So and instead of putting so much effort and giving the housing, create a public amenity for everybody can enjoy, not just a small fraction of the community. So it was a situation where we had to change the strategy by incorporating the slum dwellers, not directly into the project, but as a part of the city. But also a process through, it's a kind of integrated process, not necessary that everything has to be accommodated on the revived waterfront project. So it is important that we, and ultimately we are creating this for any such transformation projects are meant for people. And if the activity is already happening and the people are already coming here, instead of checking them out somewhere or closing that particular activity, why not integrate better, which has no harm? So people will, more and more people will eventually come, and that's the success of any urban or public project. If after doing all the effort, if the people are not coming to use that particular area, that's not successful, even if you solve a lot of other cities' problems. So that's the kind of objective in this case.
Yeah, thanks a lot for answering. And once again, it was really interesting to look at all of these projects in many different contexts. There are no questions right now. Just give me a minute. Mamta, I think there might be something wrong with my internet because I've not seen.
Yeah, so there are no questions, but please feel free to unmute and ask your questions.
Yeah.
We do have faculty members and students attending, so please feel free.
Yeah.
I hope the subject was interesting to the students, huh?
So a number of our students also kind of engage with this subject through their thesis. So I'm sure it has been really helpful to them, to be taken through a live kind of project. So
sure.
Kahin, I think maybe you can go ahead with your questions till we get some.
Or Mamta, another trick is to ask the questions directly to a person. Name the person and say, you have any question or what? Might work better that way.
Shravan, you want to go ahead?
So, I mean, there was a fairly interesting block of topics being displayed. I mean, rivers are a little, I'm not too familiar with like river ecologies and building along them. So it is quite eye-opening in that sense. But when we're talking about like environmental concerns, we're talking about all these like sort of stakeholders coming together. And like obviously say that you can't remove one of them or eliminate one of them. But are there certain stakeholders that sort of you have to cater to, like, because not because of any particular reason like that makes sense architecturally or environmentally, but because that there is a certain pull that they have in the community, like there are certain strength, like there are bylaws, for example, that bylaws are generated and you have to cater to those that may not necessarily make sense, but you've had to follow them because it's bylaws for the larger city, or whether it's like people who like certain influences like otherwise.
No, see, a good planning is, of course, you have to listen to everybody and ultimately come up with, maximize the positives in this case. Not necessary that we will cater or incorporate every comments we receive, because sometimes there are experts who has their expertise and they will only talk about in that particular aspect. But if you try to do that 100%, the other factors won't get suffice. So as a planner, urban designer, or the person who is thinking in totality has to take a call eventually. But you understand, all in last 10, 15 years, the country has actually systemized a lot of processes which needs, for example, environmental impact assessment, which is a kind of mandate for any large scale transformation project. Not for river, even if you build highways, one has to go through that. And there are two aspects to that. One is the environment should not be damaged. Doesn't mean that you can't intervene anything. So you have to also come up with a plan. Once you intervene, how do you make sure that there is no further damage to it? And what are the precautionary measures? There are social impact assessment. There is the flood management aspect. There are people who comes from even from the authority, the central government, irrigation department, for example, who worry about only the water and the flood. They don't care about the public space. So we have to have the extensive discussion and buy-in from these people. So yes, there are mandates. There are mandates in terms of rules and regulations which we have to follow. For example, I'll tell you one. In our IS code, Indian Standard Code has a mandate that if you want to intervene anything in the agricultural land area, anything, you are building a highway or you are making a ghat or a temple or anything, you have to consider 25 years of flood. That's a mandate. So there are data in the calculation which shows that 25 frequency year of flood, how high that goes. So you have to make sure that whatever you build is above 25-year flood. In urban areas, that is 100-year flood. That's why you see in my slides that flood talk, everything is 100-year because it's an urban area. So all of that are mandate. We cannot argue on the counter argument because that's something which is a process has been put together by a lot of other technical experts. So all of that is already given. What we need to do, go through that process and get thing going. Rest everything is once all of these parameters is like when you design a house, there are building bylaws, right? You have to put a margin, you have to have a certain open space, you have to have a height restrictions, and all of that is mandate. Every architect will not argue on that. The architect's creativity is that using that parameter, how that building becomes unique, that applies to the city also for any such projects. So there are parameters one has to worry. And within that, it's the responsibility of the planner or urban designer to ultimately come up with the proper solution. Our objective have always been that we work towards something which is buildable. We don't want to talk about or have any great fancy idea and keep on talking about it, but it doesn't get realized. And that's not I think our cities desperately needs physical interventions. We cannot keep on talking about it and not do anything. So although we have, when we start a project, there is always a larger idea, the objective and everything we keep in mind, but we have to break it down the task. If you don't take the first step, the second step won't come, and then eventually won't. So when it's a patience-oriented work, I have spent 15 years already into this particular subject. Sabarmati Riverfront is more than 20 years now. The Pune project we have been working on is 7 years now. So it's 7 years already. Nothing has actually moved yet, but I think the way we also have more experience, we also think about how to tackle the particular issues and problems, and we guide our clients also that way. Okay, this is the right way to do it. And of course, there are media to be managed. There are NGOs and the local activists and the experts who also has their own voice, where we make public presentations and talk about it. We get inputs and then we improve upon. That's the process we have been doing extensively for many of the projects. The Bhutan project, which I mentioned, that you saw, that meandering river and the whole thing, it's actually the project is meant for, there's a great issue with the erosion of that town. Bhutan is a very limited land where they can build because of the mountain. So they badly needed the area where they can expand the town. So the project is actually under construction. It's on a fairly under advanced stage where it's being built. in a country like Bhutan. So that's something which is, and by keeping all the regulations and everything in mind. In that case, we had to actually have a cross-country approvals also, because that river goes ultimately into the India from Bhutan, and there is an international border. So unless and until the Indian government approves, we cannot do the project in Bhutan. So that was also taken care. So yes, there are mandates, there are regulations one has to follow, but there are things which you can always come up with after that.
So I think Jimmy and Meenal both raised
Mindal
their
has
hands.
something.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
Can you switch
so
on
Jimmy,
the video, please, so I can see?
my video is not working.
Yeah.
Hi.
Okay.
I'll
Hi, Jamshid.
Hi. So, Niki, I should congratulate you and your firm for having created a model, a work model that is going to take you places for years together. You said you're working 15 years. It looks like till your retirement, you're going to be working on such projects. I have two particular questions.
Yeah.
One is, as per your research, how many cities have I'm sure you all must have done that. That how many cities in in India have rivers that pass through them that you all want to, that you think is going to be target projects in some sense?
I don't
And
think we have the list.
I'll come to the more important question.
Yeah.
And the other question is that can you please throw light on be it the Ahmedabad and the Pune model? How much of new urban land did you create through those? Are you giving back to the city, which in some sense is going to be new sellable land in the core area of the city, and that the city is going to be in a position to build new projects along the riverfront? So it's a win-win model for everybody. So you portray that, we are creating new land in the idea of river beautification. So in Ahmedabad, how much new land, urban land did you create by bringing the river close by? And in Pune, how much is it that you're doing?
Okay, I'll answer the first questions. So we don't have the list where we want to say, okay, this is where we want to do. But yes, we have been involved in 10 cities currently, where in last 10 years, we have been actively involved and working on that. But this project doesn't come, no, of course, there are official channels. The government puts up the bid if there is a willingness to do something. And then once the willingness is there and we managed to get the project, then we worked the way we worked on that case. Usually, there are a lot of government organizations or the local municipality only comes for the advice. So we give that advice. We make a presentation. We tell them what to kind of overall see. So there are projects happening in Jammu, there are projects happening in Lucknow and Hyderabad and all of these places where we've gone and done the presentation, or the team has come here. They've come from across the country also sometimes. So that happens. So it's not something which it's that we have to target the cities and to do things, but something, it's a very time consuming and a tedious process. So once we get into it, we will spend another 10 years of doing so. So that's how the whole system is. And ultimately, we are professionals and we have to have that systematic way of working with the local government also. So yeah, that's the kind of thing. And as the city, everybody realizes, not 10 years ago, nobody actually knew that such thing needs to be done. Once the one project came up, become a successful, people started using it, they see a potential in their town, okay, something needs to be done. That's how the projects get expanded. And the importance of urban design and the planning gets widely discussed. Nobody talked about urban design 15 years ago that extensively the way we talk about now. So that's the first point. And second point is every project we work has a different model of as a development model. In the Sabarmati, one of the point was because this was conceptualized 23 years ago, the finance became a very critical point. If you don't have the money, you won't be able to do such projects at that time. Now we have budgets in our cities for such projects. Earlier it was not. So in Sabarmati, we said that, let's do a project. Ahmedabad didn't have the land, so we had to create the land by reclaiming the land. So in Ahmedabad, we have around 200 hectares of land, which is generated 180 hectares, sorry, 200 is another 20 is integrated from the existing functions only. So as a project, it is 200 land. Out of 200 hectare, 14%, 14%, we have kept it for the commercial development. Because ultimately, Ahmedabad, where the river is contextualized, it's actually in the center of the town, where the central business district and the future expansion are going to come, metro is going to come, and all of that. So we have kept it the 14% available for such private developments, commercial developments. But it has a special bylaws, volumetric regulations to that. So then you don't take over the land as a compound wall and privatize the waterfront. Only building footprints will be sold and the volume will be sold. Rest of the land will be public accessible. So that's point number one. Rest of the land, 86% is some percentage goes into streets and other public amenities like event centers, public toilets, and those kind of things, and the public parks. So around 56, 57% is absolutely pure public parks and the promenades in the entire project. So that's the kind of mechanism we have in Ahmedabad. In the case of Pune, where the funding is done by various sources. There is a local government, central government, there are finances and other things, where the commercial development is not the objective. There is not much land. I actually don't have the precise number, but it's around 90 hectare of land, you can say 70 to 90 hectare, which we eventually generate. Most of the land goes into the embankment, landscape embankment, sloping embankment, and the plantations. And there are bits and pieces land available for public amenities, carts, smaller streets, integration with the public transportation like metro, and some sort of market, food courts, and facilities like that. And public parks. Of course, there are public parks proposed throughout the land. So in the Pune, we really don't have any active commercial land for selling. It is a public project. So what eventually we'll get is the protected river edge, promenades, space for parking the vehicles to access the riverfront, gardens. There are beautiful gardens already existing. So we're going to integrate that garden as a part of the river thing also, so people can actually use the land. So that's the situations just now. This is particularly, I'm talking about Mula Mutha River project, which is in the heart of the Pune city.
Thanks, Niki. Thank you. Nice knowing you. Thank you. Bye.
Meenal as well had something.
Yeah. Yeah. Hi. Hi, Niki. That was really nice. I'm sorry. I'm going to shut off my video because
Sure.
I have to hold it up. So I just wanted to show you off. So yeah.
Yes,
so
yes.
yeah,
Thank
my
you
question
so much.
was. My question was. There have been these larger national policies regarding forest, regarding waste, regarding water, rivers, and all the other water bodies. And we do know that, and actually it's not a question, it's just an observation that I feel, and it's a constant kind of a questioning attitude that one develops. So over a period of time, when you observe these kind of lacunas, you see, especially in urban areas, where you just showed in your presentation also the present state of, like we say, Mithi in Mumbai or in any other cities. Now the question here is, or the observation is here is, that when we have these larger policies in place, we are talking about ULBs, yani ki urban local bodies, talking about EIA and all the projects taking for general environmental impact assessments. In spite of all these, why do you think that such situations happen in the first place? Okay, I agree that over the period of time, people do not have the land and the slums have come up. But then what is then the role of the government to get past this? And over your 15 years of experience, have you come across such situations where, and it was really heartening to see that the Indrayani project, the city has approved of your plan and it's going to go ahead with the kind of interventions you guys are planning. And that's really heartening. But in such cases like Mithi, where everything is like on bank, what do you think could be the solutions, and how do you think these lacunas occur in the first place? I know it's a little larger.
No, I'll tell you briefly whatever experience I have knowing this particular policies. Basically, what has happened that even if you see, I'll just start with one because it's something which is impact the environmental impact assessment. That policy is there in the country for since 2006. Earlier, there was no official policy So when anything prior, there was no procedure to actually address this matter. So so that has come up later part of the in this century. So many of these policies are actually new compared to and these problems are actually there beyond that time. One thing is every city has to understand in their larger plan, the riverfront projects or the addressing the river is one of the subject which city is supposed to deal with. But the city has their own problems, the infrastructure problems, pollution problems, garbage collection problems, and the overall uh, city plan, I would say. So development plans or everything. What we, as a city, we are not doing is we do create development plans and the city plans and the local area plans and everything. But keeping those plans doesn't have the influence from these policies. It might have started recently. Some of the cities are doing it well, hopefully. If the city is taking help of a planner, an urban designer, or somebody who is also thinking from this aspect, that will slowly will improve the city planning process. I think most of the problem what we see in the river, which I'm explaining, is not because of the river and the immediate context. It's actually the poor city planning and how they manage the city. If they have a good infrastructure plan, like say drainage network and the sewerage network and the stormwater network, such pollution doesn't come into the river. But because we don't worry about it, and there is a lot of illegal activity, illegal connections to those infrastructure, ultimately results into a polluting the river or the lakes. That's the kind of thing we have. So if you have a better city planning, most of these projects, what I'm portraying here, some of the problems will be actually gone by that. And you don't worry about that for such intervention. You only worry about protecting the river from the ecological point of view and making it public accessible and those kind of things. But pollution has become so a kind of a nuisance that because of city has not taken any steps, the riverfront projects or such intervention needs to worry about that as a primary objective. Otherwise, nothing happens. So I think as the time progresses, when this policy becomes more part of the daily lives of our planning system in the city, hopefully, apart from the river, many of the city areas because there are beautiful forest areas in the Maharashtra or in Gujarat or other areas, Nagpur we have worked on, where we completely neglect those aspects. So if the policy is taken seriously and there are steps for that, I think there'll be something streamlined eventually, is what it is. But most of the problem you see in our cities in Mithi River or Muda Mutha or in a situation like Nagpur and everywhere. We've done something in Nagpur also some time ago. It's the same situation because city is not addressing that problem in a nutshell. It has nothing to do with the river. The slums are there everywhere in the city, not just the river. Yeah. So it's also a larger planning dialogue in that case. Yeah.
Thanks.
But
thanks.
thankfully, the country has taken these topics very seriously. So there are policies are coming up to protect. There is a this Green Tribunal who also actively worked on any large scale development where they have to go through that process of conveying what you're doing and what are the measures you are going to do. Nobody is saying no to this. No, our biggest problem in our mind is that because of these policies, we won't be able to do this. That's why they do illegal work or they bypass this process by whatever process they want to do. But if you actually follow the steps and figure it out, what actually is, and at least have a double thinking on it, at least think a little hard, you may find a solution and actually go through the policies, which will ultimately help the project or the city. So that's something which we are yet to experience as Indians, I would say. We don't take policy seriously. That's the problem.
And this seems to be an uphill task of involving planners.
It is an uphill task. It's a
in the
tedious
city planning
job.
Yes.
Yeah, it is a tedious job, and one has to just stick to it, and then you have to continuously push the thing. And sometimes the solution is on paper, on a city planning level, you can have a broad policies. But the project like this river interventions or the lake interventions, where these policies are actually pushed on the ground, and that becomes the example for people to understand, yes, you can actually do it. So please do it. Something like that. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
That was
So
lovely
yeah,
presentation, by the way.
Thank you so much, Mila. Thank you.
Yeah, so I also I had a question regarding the biodiversity and I don't know if so in Delhi there's this lake called Neela House, and there are really a bunch of lakes that are sort of in the city. They're not really connected to each other officially by any waterway, but they're kind of these three biodiversity hotspots that are very close to each other. So when you work on a project like this, in for example this take the Pune project along the Indani River, what when you're considering the biodiversity, are you only considering what happens in the river and the river's edge, or is there more beyond that? Do you also consider how surrounding ecologies from a certain other parts of the city are affected or influenced by the biodiversity boost that's happening in the river?
So when we do first of all, it is important that we understand this area extensively for the matters like this. So in the beginning part of the couple of months in the project or a couple of months into this particular exercise, we actually get to know the lay of land very much, immediate or whatever is the connected topics. So if it's so let's say a river has a lot of tributaries. Depends on the city we talk about. Tributaries are in various sizes. So it also connect, and then it spreads over the city. So when we think about the river as a line, and then there are fingers going into the city because the water also comes from the city. It's a natural contour state, contour way of addressing those things. So yes, we do understand that this is what the connected topics are, or the subjects are, the areas are, and sometimes we, because it's a project or there is a definite boundary where we have to intervene. But beyond that, we in our initial reports, or we say feasibility reports, we addresses these things. We tell them these are the additional things city has to do to make it more integrated and everything. Sometimes the solution is given as an idea, but not done as a part of the project because they are relatively, ultimately it covers the entire city, I would say. So we cannot do in one go everything, but there are recommendations given to the city, local government, that needs to be done. One of the example I would put it, not linked with the river project, but we have worked on the okay, sorry, it's in the context of river only, in Baroda, in Vadodara. The very small river passing through the city where the crocodiles are, the photo you saw. And it's a beautiful place. I've studied in Baroda, so I know that place very well. But it's actually a nala. It's not a river. It's a very tiny space. It's a nala. It's a crocodile inside, so nobody actually goes towards the river because of the threat from the crocodile. But Baroda city has beautiful lakes in the overall vicinity. And in the time of Marathas, where the Sayaji Rao and all the people who used to rule this particular region did build a lot of lakes, and all of that lakes were connected as a network. So there is this Ajwa Dam, which has a freshwater reservoir, which has a gravity line going to the city. This is all I'm talking about 200 years ago system. And all these lakes were filled with water, this underground connection. So there is a network of lakes. And so what we had come up with after learning this history part of it, there are a couple of experts from the Baroda we kind of collaborated with. We understood that, okay, there is a way, because these rivers needs eventually a water. And if we can figure it out some way to link these lakes again, the lakes connection has gone because of the urbanization. So then they doesn't exist except one or two. So we said those 20 lakes, 20 odd numbers lakes can be connected. And in this time, the technology exists to connect them without doing too much kind of changes, and also link the river to that area. So when the monsoon comes, when the excessive water comes from the upper hills, the lakes gets filled. They're connected in a way that there is a water into that, and also use this water smartly for the river and brings the water into the river. So there were such ideas we had gone into those label. But of course, because there are individual, it caters the larger city, we cannot incorporate everything as a part of the project. But there are advice and the suggestions we have already documented. So when the time comes, when these things can happen, it can actually can be materialized in the future. Similarly, 20 years ago, when we worked on the riverfront project, this whole using the treated water from the sewerage treatment plant and putting back in the river was never a technology available at that time. Nobody has thought about something like this can happen in our cities. So, but we had that idea as a part of the plan that eventually you can actually replenish the river by treating the water and put it in the river itself. So slowly it's going to happen now because the technology has come up. City is already building the tertiary treatment plants in the various part of the cities and using that treated water now for the plantations and the filling of the river at one point. So there'll be time where we'll have treated water in the river additionally. So all of that is something we go through as a part of the project cycle. Not everything is physically materialized because there are limitations of the jurisdictions, but there is always a documentation and the suggestions incorporated in the larger master plan. So that's what we currently do. I hope that answers your question.
That was, Mamta, how much time do we have?
Yeah, Kahin, so we've run out of time.
All right. Great.
Yeah.
So, it was a great presentation. Thank you very much. It was quite enlightening.
Thank you so much.
And I'm sure most everyone's questions have been answered. And if there's anything else, I suppose they can hold on to that.
Yeah.
All right.
You have my email address. If there are specific thing, if anybody wants to know from their studio exercise point of view, they can compile it. One person can compile and send the questions. We will try to answer them, which can help the studio projects also. So that's fine.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, that will be wonderful. Thank you so much, Niki.
Thank you so much, Mamta.
For being here. Yeah. Thanks, Kayan. Thanks, Shravan.
Thanks.
Bye,
See you.
guys.
Bye,
Thank
guys.
you, Niki,
Bye.
so much.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was really
Thank you.
wonderful.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.